Today's meeting is called Over the Rainbow, Pride, Protest and LGBT plus Liberation. Nicola Field is going to be speaking. She's a member of the SWP in Southwark, in South London. She was an original member of Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, whose story was told in the hit film Pride. Her book, Over the Rainbow, Money, Class and Homophobia, was first published in 1995. It contains the earliest published first-hand account of LGSM and confronts the political contradictions in the LGBT plus movement. It was republished last year with new material reflecting on the impact of the film Pride and the issues facing the LGBT plus movement in the 21st century. It'll be on sale at the end, over there, and Nicola will be happy to sign copies. So Nicola is going to talk about the fight for LGBT plus liberation in the 21st century, and she'll be talking about this for 30 minutes. Then there'll be time for questions and contributions. Nicola.
I broke it. Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thanks for coming. I want to sort of start off by saying we had Pride in London yesterday. And it's one of hundreds of marches and events that's now held across towns and cities across the UK and across the world. In 2016, there were actually 65 LGBT Pride events in the UK and 234 across the US. Millions of working class people attend to defend the principle of freedom in sexual and gender expression. Now, the Metropolitan Police was very much on show yesterday. But not as aggressors like they were when they inflicted fatal injuries on Edson da Costa, arresting him in Newham last month. And not like they were when they arrested and charged one of the organisers of this very festival 2 weeks ago when she was on a protest against fascists in central London. No, these police were there to join in the Pride celebration. And they wore these smart little rainbow epaulets. And I'm going to kind of focus on the Pride tradition because I think it really encapsulates some of the essential contradictions of a movement that tries to unite people around sexuality and gender identity and tries to go across class interests to do that and create what I believe is a non-existent LGBT community. Do let me know if it goes faint because I think this is slipping down a bit. Now, Pride is a very contended space, and I think it's really important to look at it in terms of a political argument that's going on within the LGBT movement. I'm going to go back in time a little bit because I think it's important to understand where it's all coming from. Now, the Pride March tradition started as a result of the Stonewall Rebellion in New York in 1969. Now, at this time in America, there was a very high level of persecution and repression of LGBT people following the McCarthyite witch hunts against the left in the 1940s and 50s. And gays were actually banned, legally banned, from working in the public sector. So, of course, gays did work in the public sector, but it just meant that they had to be completely secretive and in the closet. And, the fear of being outed was really real. It wasn't just like you were fear you're going to be embarrassed. You were fear your life was going to be in ruins. And many people committed suicide when they were actually outed. Now, it was illegal to have gay sex, but it was also illegal to dance, for same-sex couples to dance together or even to kiss in a gay bar. Now, the rich gays had their private clubs, but the working classes only had sort of more rough places. Most of them were run by the mafia. And the way it worked was that the club owners would pay bribes to the police. The police would come and raid on a sort of routine basis, arrest people, take them to the station, fine them, let them go. Then it would all start up again. And the Stonewall Inn was one of these places. It was a mafia-run, filthy and unhygienic dive in Greenwich Village. But it was also a haven, because Greenwich Village was a destination for LGBT people who came from small towns, often thrown out by their hostile families. And people who came to the Stonewall Inn were often homeless children. The mafia-run bars were actually the only place that they could get off the streets at night. Now, on June the 28th, 1969, the police turned up, usual raid, started to go through the motions. The managers were upstairs getting the bribes ready, and downstairs the police were loading people into the wagons. But then suddenly there was a change. A lesbian who was being loaded into a wagon started to struggle and fight back, and the drag queens around her came forward to defend her. And suddenly it lit up. A spark was lit. And it turned into a riot. The police behaved incredibly repressively and violently, and the queers fought back. And gays came from other bars to come and help and join in, and it quickly escalated. And the next day, the news of the rebellion spread. Socialists came to support, as we always do. Black activists, straight people came to show their support. And this battle continued for 6 consecutive nights, and the police were utterly humiliated. And this riot, this working class riot of poor people against the police, kick-started the modern LGBT movement, the movement that we know today. And everything changed at that moment. It was a real political breakthrough. And Allen Ginsberg, the poet, said that as he was wandering through Greenwich Village after the riots, he said, the queers have lost that wounded look. So you can really understand that it was a change in the way that people saw themselves as agents in society. Now, that week saw the founding of a conscious revolutionary force, the Gay Liberation Front, which, over time spread to other countries, including the UK. And its members, most of them socialists, saw the fight against LGBT oppression as part of the radical social and political upheaval that was confronting the ruling class in the USA at the time, the Black Power movement, the anti-war movement, the women's liberation movement. And 1 month later, the first Pride March happened, where people marched from Christopher Street to Washington Square, that led by a banner that said Gay Power. But even in the first days of the movement, there were arguments and differences around tactics and perspectives. There were those who wanted legal reform, like they'd seen happen in the UK, where gay sex between men had been partially decriminalised. They said, let's just have that. We'll be happy with that. Don't make too much trouble. But the GLF activists who saw the need for a total revolution of the economic and social order, but even they were calling for the gay bars to be run by gay business people. Now, obviously, at the time, that would have been a huge step forward, but we need to bear it in mind as we go forward through this story. I'm just going to read from my book where an activist at the time, Chuck Rowlands, who'd been part of the Mattachine Society, it's a gay rights organisation, he describes a disagreement at a convention which could equally be applied to the movement ever since. So what he said was, to most of the people who attended that convention, the only way we were ever going to get along in society was by being nice, quiet, polite little boys that our maiden aunts would have approved of. We were not going to get along in the world by going out and flaunting our homosexuality. There were people of goodwill who would help us, but we could not do anything naughty, like having picket signs or parades. Only communists would do things like that. Okay, well, thank goodness there were communists who did things like that. So these divisions continued, and the GLF actually, really fell apart by the early 1970s, but it had a huge impact. And despite the disagreements, the new movement was really unstoppable. By the time I first encountered the lesbian and gay movement in the 80s in London, there was a really vibrant counterculture. Pride was an annual event in New York, San Francisco, other major cities, including London. This was in Thatcher's Britain. And the legal position of LGBT people in the UK at that time was really dire. I mean, the age of consent for sex between men was still 21 and only in private, where it was 16 for straight sex. Obviously, there was no same-sex marriage. You could be sacked for being gay. You could lose your children. You could get beaten up. And if you decided to go and report it, you risked being charged with offences against public decency yourself when you went to report that you'd been beaten up for being gay. Police routinely staked out gay clubs, seeking to arrest people. They entrapped men in meeting places. They attacked LGBT protests. They were certainly not wearing their rainbow epaulets at that time. HIV and AIDS was starting to spread, and you might hope that that would be an opportunity for compassion. Unfortunately, no. It was dubbed the gay plague by the sun, and the ruling class ruthlessly and viciously used the HIV and AIDS pandemic to attack LGBT people. Now, I think LGBT people really occupied the position at that time that Muslims and refugees occupy now in Britain. And that is, they were ideological scapegoats framed to take the blame for the effects of attacks that were being inflicted by the Thatcher government, which the Thatcher government was introducing neoliberal economics into this country, dismantling the welfare state. And of course, that was affecting people. You know, they were closing mines, cutting the NHS, selling off council housing, privatising utilities. And this was affecting people, and they needed a group in society that could take the blame. And that they kept up that assault. Thatcher brought in Section 28 in 1988, which effectively stopped teachers by law from mentioning same-sex relationships in the classroom. And this wasn't repealed until 2003, 6 years into Blair's government. And the movement was really dominated by left-wing identity politics. It wasn't very welcoming to bisexuals and trans people, intersex people, let alone heterosexuals. The basis in Pride in the 1980s was a network of community organisations that was set up to try and offset the effects of the oppression and the repression in society. And they were funded by authorities like the Greater London Council. And for this, they were dubbed part of the loony left by the right-wing press. And Thatcher abolished the Greater London Council in 1986. It was a huge attack on the left. And she'd got the confidence to do that through the defeat of the miners' strike. Now, if you've seen the film Pride, you know that on Pride 85, there was something really important happened, which was that there was a contingent of miners and their families who led the march in return for solidarity that had been organised by the Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners group, LGSM, during the strike. And that connection had really shown that combating prejudice isn't necessarily a slow process of mental enlightenment, but in uniting against a common enemy, prejudice can come tumbling down overnight. And in this case, the enemy was Thatcher and everything she stood for. And I personally learned at that time that the enemy isn't straight people, it's the forces in society that sort of sow and nurture the seeds of toxic hate. So everyone involved in the miners' strike was absolutely changed forever, both consciously and unconsciously. And if you've seen the film Pride, you know that the miners, that had the effect of, at last, even though activists have been trying for years to get the Labour Party and TUC to take on sexuality rights, at last they did take on lesbian and gay rights. And the reason for that was the official bloc backing of the entire National Union of Mine Workers. Now, I wrote this book originally in 1994. And during the 1990s, lesbian and gay people were still under attack and assault from the state, exactly the same as they had been in the 80s. There hadn't really been any legal changes. And the defeat of the miners' strike had really dented working class confidence across society. The movement for sexual liberation had moved on to committees, into trade union equality groups, and into cultural activism, and further away from the class struggle that had taken us so much forward in the past. There was a real focus on language as a cause rather than an effect of oppression, and I think that idea that if you change language you can stop oppression is still with us and holding the movement back today. But the visibility of LGBT people continued to grow, very much in film, TV, art, theatre, and slick, fashionable, confident gay businessmen, they were men, were making money. Soho became this kind of cruising ground, shopping ground for gay people. And it really heralded a shift to serious commercialisation of the Pride March, which is what I'm going to come on to next. At the time, in the 90s, the Pride Trust was basically dominated by this layer of the really fashionable, openly gay businessmen. And the left of the movement was angry about it, and it led to a big showdown in 1993, which I think really illustrates the conflict between classes if you're trying to unite people on the basis of sexuality. So in 1993, Peter Tatchell suggested something about the Pride March. What he said was, he wrote in the Pink Paper that the Pride Trust should turn the festival into a full-scale civil rights march instead of all this commercialisation. What he said was, with good planning, we ought to be able to mobilise 100,000 people. Another idea that could help increase participation and media coverage is a specific theme, a simple and concrete human rights demand that we can all agree on, such as, can you guess, equal rights at work. Quite a good idea, in my opinion. That's me talking. But going back to that time, Tatchell had touched on a sore point. Workers' rights are not popular with employers, be they gay or straight. Now, where is the bit where they said... Pride, the Pride Trust. Pride means many different things to different people. Oh, it sounds so like today, doesn't it? Even within the Pride Trust, directors have differing personal responses to the meaning of pride. To impose such a theme on the parade, such as equal rights at work, would be divisive and set a very dangerous precedent. Well, I'm very glad that the precedent was set, and we're able to refer back to it. Okay, so, good. I'm on time, I think. By the way, I did do interviews with those slick gay business people. In my book, there's a chapter called Hostile Brothers, and they really reveal their attitudes as employers, and they reveal their attitudes towards their employees and their ideas about pay. And I do. It is quite entertaining, but I do recommend you brace yourself before you start reading it. Now, just have a drink. So, 21st century, I think these contradictions that have been growing all the way through the modern movement are even deeper today. We've got huge advances in legal rights. We've got same-sex marriage, employment rights, parenting rights, which is fantastic. Let's celebrate that, for God's sake. Housing rights, pensions, LGBT hate crime is now legally recognised. Many young people just accept LGBT lives as being part of a diverse multicultural society, which is fantastic. And these are huge achievements from campaigning over many decades. But does it mean what a lot of the leaders of the movement and the Pride organisers say, which is, we're all liberated now, let's just have a party, shut up, we don't need any more protest? Well, David Cameron accepted a Pink News Award for legalising same-sex marriage, but David Cameron was the architect of something called austerity. And austerity really hits LGBT people hard, and this is where we need to look at the reality of people's lives. The housing catastrophe means that young people are forced to stay with their hostile families or hide their true selves or run away. And remember those homeless youngsters in Greenwich Village? We've now got that on the streets of so-called gay-friendly Britain and San Francisco and New York, all places that pride themselves on being open. Library cuts mean that young people haven't got access to finding out information in their own way, privately, away from, prying, controlling eyes of their families. I'm talking about my own parents there. I'm sure you've all got much nicer parents than me. The health cuts are blocking access to trans health and mental health cuts, despite the self-righteous hype that we're hearing from Theresa May saying she takes mental health seriously. The number of young people arriving in A&E with psychiatric problems has doubled since 2009, and almost 19,000 teenagers were admitted to hospital for self-harm in 2015, 2016. But mental health services have faced annual cuts of £538 million a year. The HIV prevention medicine PrEP is still not available on the NHS, and loads of horrible 1980s-style moral arguments are used to justify that. 300 youth groups have been cut in London alone. That's where people go for support. That's where people go for some kind of community. They're not just LGBT groups, but they're all youth groups across the board. all this, on top of tuition fees, poverty wages, 0 hours contracts, I imagine that being able to get married is not really much good if you can't get a job or a home. So Cameron being seen as a hero for bringing in same-sex marriage, apart from the fact that he's a self-aggrandizing hypocrite, because he didn't write that legislation, it had been campaigned for many years, and Labour had already prepared the legislation, and my sister wrote it under Harriet Harman. I'm not a big fan of Harriet Harman, she's my MP, but it was Labour that did that, but Cameron totally took the credit for that. I think that, the fact that he was lauded for that is an example of the modern phenomenon of what we call pinkwashing, which is using LGBT issues to cover up attacks and repression. Israel is the prime mover at this. It's carrying out genocidal and repressive occupation of Palestinian land while putting on an upscale, world-class pride march to make itself look really progressive, and obviously buy off the LGBT community. Back to so-called liberated Britain. As everyone is now aware, one of the 4 parts of the United Kingdom is Northern Ireland. It's run by the DUP, which has been blocking same-sex marriage rights. And, in Northern Ireland, homophobic crimes have been rising year on year since 2007. So in the UK, going back to the reality, violent homophobic assaults and harassment offences are rising, but more than 75% of homophobic hate crime is still not reported, and transgender hate crime is the least reported hate crime in the UK. I just want to I wasn't going to say this, but I just have to read you this. Arlene Foster, the leader of the DUP, in the election of Trump, it really shows that the rights that have been won can be rolled back by bigots and right-wingers, and it can happen really fast. The day after Trump got elected, flyers were distributed in men's restrooms at Texas State University, and these flyers said, and it's horrible, okay, "Now that our man Trump is elected, time to organise tar and feather vigilante squads and go and arrest and torture those deviant university leaders spouting off that diversity garbage." That's what we're up against, the hidden result of bigots getting into power. I'm going to go on to the situation in schools. I think the situation for young people, it's really important because, of course, we always celebrate that young people are growing up in a much more open society. But things are very contradictory there. Now, bullying is down a bit in schools. Nearly half of LGBT pupils, including 64% of trans pupils, are bullied for being LGBT. And this is down a little bit from 2012, when it was 55%. The progress, and they were also asking pupils, like, does your school say that homophobic bullying is wrong? Does your school say that transphobic bullying is wrong? And even at this stage, 3 in 10 LGBT pupils report that their schools don't say anything about homophobic bullying. And 3 out of 5 LGBT pupils say their school says absolutely nothing about transphobic bullying being wrong. So progress is happening, but it's very, very slow. Only 1 in 5 LGBT pupils have been taught about safe sex in same-sex relationships. More than 2 in 5 trans young people have attempted suicide, and 1 in 5 lesbian and gay and bi students have attempted suicide. And I have to report that is exactly the same statistic as in the 1980s when a report came out called 1 in 5, which was funded by the GLC. Now, Section 28 abolished the ban on talking about same-sex relationships, but what was put in its place? There should have been an influx of people, personnel, funding, ideas, training resources into schools to counteract the effects of what had gone before. And it wasn't. Now, there are pockets of excellent practice. Now, I'm going to embarrass Michael, but Michael is one of the teachers across the country, heroes in my opinion, who have faced down institutional resistance to fight LGBT phobia in schools. And I was privileged to visit his school in Wanstead last year for LGBT History Month. And I was at an event. Well, I was just bowled over, really. The students there were totally concerned with creating safety and support for freedom of expression and being and safety for their fellow pupils. And they were talking about how to do that, how to create safe spaces. The whole event was chaired by a 15-year-old trans Muslim girl. And there was an incredibly sophisticated discussion about labelling, which really went above my head, which I'm proud to say, it was amazing. But this work, like Michael's work, it really relies on people like him being really confident, having the backup to take the initiative and take on management. And not everybody's got that. And Ofsted is now testing schools on their LGBT work. So the instrument of punishing and division, Ofsted's there to set schools against each other, set them up in competition with each other. And they're turning LGBT rights within schools into a sort of stick to beat schools. How is that helpful? It's not helpful in any way. And, again, where are the resources and the funding to pay for the help that's needed for LGBT phobia to be eradicated, as I think it could be eradicated very, very quickly. Because schools funding, for all the teachers in this room, I'm sure there are quite a few, know that schools funding is just being slashed right across the board in a very, very frightening way. And I see school students campaigning against it independently. It's a very, very contradictory situation, or you can see the contradictions if you look at the Pride march internationally. Pride in Spain recently was attacked by fascists. The police there did absolutely nothing to stop those attacks. Turkey Pride in Istanbul was attacked by the police. The police arrested people, piled them into police vans and played Quran CDs to them really loudly as a sort of form of torture. Ghana, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Britain backs all these homophobic governments and does arms deals and oil deals with them and doesn't challenge their homophobic laws. Now, looking at the reality of LGBT lives in Britain, what did the Pride organisers in London say this year about the DUP and about bullying in schools and housing and so on? Nothing. It's now run by a consortium set up by Boris Johnson when he was mayor, and it's a big tourist event. For the first time yesterday, numbers were officially limited to 26,500. Actually, 1 million came, but you had to be part of a paying group to go on the march, and you had to wear a designated wristband. It was absolutely horrible to see people scrabbling over wristbands and trying to extort them from each other to get on the march. And the rest of the people turning up on the march were invited to be spectators. Isn't that nice? So you could go behind the police barriers and just sort of cheer and wave as people went past with their wristbands on, because they'd all paid. This is the reality of Pride now in London. Yep, thank you. So the main partner of Pride, other than the Mayor of London, is the crooked bank Barclays. It's been a principal sponsor for several years. It's getting more and more influence, being investigated for the second time over its dodgy deals in the banking crisis. And there are smiling Barclays personnel pinkwashing all over the Pride website. Other sponsors you might be interested to hear are CMS Corporate Law Firm. They advise businesses on how to avoid paying tax. Starbucks, who employ people gay people a lot on 0 hours contracts and won't pay a living wage. NBC Universal International, very big media corporation. Virgin Atlantic, Delta Airlines, Vodafone, Visa, lots of the legalised drug alcohol, Smirnoff, Stolly, Miller. Oh yeah, and the Evening Standard, edited by Cameron's old sidekick, George Osborne. So they are all in it together. And New York and San Francisco are even worse. They have these premium tickets, VIP tickets, where you pay more so that you can sort of hear the speakers. and sit on a chair, even at the family events, you know, and if you're poor, you can just sit on a blanket. So the business people want to divorce pride from protest as much as possible, but I argue that it's actually a really, really political event. It's really political in the wrong way. It's the politics of the market, the politics of exploitation, the politics of lying, the politics of pinkwashing, the politics of covering up the absolute grinding poverty, fear, fear of the future, the debt, the housing problems that the LGBT people face. All this is just completely covered up by the Pride March so that they can make, it's a big tourist attraction and make loads and loads of money. But you see, there's protest against this. Last year, San Francisco Pride was going to be led by Black Lives Matter. But when the Pride organisers said after the Orlando massacre that the Pride March had to be policed heavily, Black Lives Matter said, no, the police are the enemy. And they pulled out. And this created a big row. And at the moment, because Trump's been elected and people are aware of, you know, his threat to roll back same-sex marriage, there's calls right across the US for all the Pride marches to be reinstated as proper political protest marches. And it's, you know, this is fantastic. You know, it's a massive opportunity for socialists to feed the hunger for politics and to offer explanations for the splits, the divisions, the deprivation, and explain how the Pride March has become so commercialised, to explain that the very nature of capitalism is, as Marx said, capitalism restlessly and relentlessly runs all over the world, seeking out new markets. And I believe this is what has happened with the LGBT commercialization. It's the seeking out of new markets because they're always looking for more money to squeeze out of working class people. I think it's an opportunity now to explain where LGBT and other oppressions come from, what purpose they serve in our society. I hope people will talk about that. I think we need to fight oppression at its very roots by fighting the system that produces it. I wrote about the family and the emergence of capitalism in the first chapter of Over the Rainbow. See, capitalism does need workers, otherwise it's not going to make any money, and workers need to be brought up to quite an adult age before they can be working, and that has to be done at as least cost as possible, and that is where some of the gender roles that dominate us and divide us have come in. And I hope people will talk about this. There was a very good talk on intersectionality and privilege theory on Friday, which I really recommend people listen to look at some of the dominating ideas that are in the LGBT movement at the moment that I think are holding it back. So I think fighting oppression goes alongside fighting the attacks on education, marketisation, privatisation, commodification of things like education and health, the attacks by Ofsted. And I think every blow against the system, everything we do to weaken the Tories, everything we do to stop public pay restraint, every time we hit out against cuts and closures and privatisation, against attacks on Muslims and refugees, all these are striking at the heart of the system that benefits from the divisions between us. So just say there are these 66 Pride marches this year, because fantastically Lancaster had its first Pride march this year, and they consciously said we want it to be an anti-commercial community pride, and that was actually really led by our comrades, and they're not necessarily LGBT. So there are all these Pride marches in the UK, 66, and so I think we as socialists really have our work cut out. Thank you.
So firstly, I just want to thank Nicola for a wonderful speech. And I really like what you were saying about the commercialisation of Pride, and I also think it's really important to note that we had Pride in London yesterday, and for the first time in, I think, quite a while, a political group, Lesbians and Gay Support Migrants, pushed through to get to the front, and they were inviting people to, they were literally lifting them over the police fences so that people who hadn't paid could get in and support them. Yeah. And I think this is just showing that a lot of the LGBT community is actually rejecting this corporate nature and the commercialisation of Pride, and I would encourage you all to do the same and come along next year.
Can I start by saying thank you, because I never get tired of hearing, and every time I do hear you speak, I learn something new. And I do want to start by saying that as a Muslim woman, as a long-term anti-racist campaigner, the LGBT activists are my heroes, because I've learned so much about the importance of standing in solidarity and who the enemy are. Because as Muslims, I mean, when you were talking, and it made me think about some of the stuff that we hear. So the idea of, the LGBT community, we all need to be nice and, just fit in. God, as a Muslim woman, I'm so sick of hearing that. I'm so sick of being told, well, come on, you know what? If you just stop being an angry Muslim, we would get rid of Islamophobia. If you just dress smarter or got a better job and we had more management positions and all that kind of shit. And actually, that's not true, is it? That it's not about how we fit in. It's about the politics and also about how they divide us. I mean, when you talked about Section 28 and how that was used to stop any discussion in schools, well, what about Prevent? What is that doing presently with the Muslim community? And you see, Prevent is being used to criminalise the Muslim community across the board in every section. But actually, it doesn't just criminalise the Muslim community, it attacks public sector workers. Because as far as I'm concerned, and I think every public sector worker in this room would agree, you're here to deliver a service. You're here to support people that use that service. And actually, what that legislation does is makes you in opposition, as from the people that you're meant to be delivering a service for. It actually makes you suspicious of those people rather than supporting those people. But also, it's not just the people that you deliver a service for, it's your colleagues. If those colleagues are Muslim, well, do they have British values? Am I meant to be reporting them? And there are reports of that. We're getting NUT teachers, Muslim NUT teachers, who are being reported for not having adequate British values. One example is a teacher that was speaking to another colleague during the 1 minute silence, and she was reported because she was a Muslim teacher talking to a non-Muslim teacher, but actually she was seen as having not having adequate British values. Another example is of a young primary school teacher, Muslim teacher, who raised the fact that she didn't want she was concerned about showing footage of 9/11 to her primary school class because she didn't think it was appropriate for them to see that. And again, she was reported and she's being investigated. So you can see the similarities of what's happening with Section 28 and what's happening within the Muslim community. I mean, we have to learn who the enemy is. And they would like to tell us, we've heard this so often, haven't they, that one of the things that Muslims have a problem with, or one of the key British values, is we don't support LGBT rights. I'm sorry, everything you said indicates that actually, where do the Tories support? I'm not going to take lectures from the Tory government while they slash LGBT rights. And I think that's why it's so important that we work together. And the organisation I'm so proud of working closest with is LGBT Plus Against Islamophobia, because that cuts through the myth that we are on opposite sides, that actually those people that are trying to divide us are there defending your rights against me. Actually, we have more in common. Let's be quite honest and quite clear here. Muslim brothers and sisters have more in common with our LGBT brothers and sisters than we ever have with those that try to divide us. And if anyone has any doubts, you see, at 1 minute we are the enemy. The Muslim community is the enemy, the other within society. But actually, when it suits Theresa May, she's more than happy to go to Saudi Arabia and sell arms. She has no problem with that Muslim. The problem she has with is a Muslim working class here in this country. And that's why it's really important to understand that it is about class. It's not about religion or our gender roles or anything else. It is about the ruling class, attacking us. I mean, who can forget Trump when he was in Saudi Arabia not so long ago, spouting rubbish about how great, and how he was and how much in touch he was with the Muslim community in Saudi Arabia. What he meant is that he massively supported the Saudi ruling class against the Muslims in America. He had no problem putting the ban on Muslims travelling into the US. Actually, when you look at the ban, it went across all the communities, but it was about stopping poor people coming to that country too. Just as when it comes to Britain, when they talk about, pulling back on, immigration. What they're talking about is working class people travelling across the country. You know, when you look at the rich millionaires, that they're more than happy to come into this country from the Arab countries. You know, they've got all these visa waiver systems that allow millionaires to come in and spend summer travelling around, you know, driving their big expensive cars around Knightsbridge. It's them against us, and let's be quite clear on that.
Comrades here will be followed by the comrades in the corner.
I think the last speaker's point about immigration is a class issue. We know rich people can move around the world. It's always working class people that get attacked. You know, on the Pride March yesterday, it was disgusting to see the Virgin Atlantic float. They had the song Umbrella. You know, the line "You will always be my friend." Virgin Atlantic deports asylum seekers. How can they be on? How can you have people like that on the march? One of the inspiring things was a young woman saying to me, "There's a dozen or so Islamophobes on the march. You know, Allah is gay and all this stuff." She was really disgusted at that and saying how bad it was that there was cheers from people on bystanding when that went past. So, you know, she's 19, she's straight from Stoke-on-Trent, never been on Pride, loved it, but thought that was a downside. And that was the first thing she said to me about the march straight afterwards. So it's, you know, when we talk about, you know, liberation, you know, we've won all these rights, but you know, there's fees now for employment tribunals. So if you're discriminated against at work and you get sacked, you have to find £1,000 to go to tribunal. Maybe your union will fund it, but you know that's right has been taken away. A friend of mine went for his HIV support meeting last August and said, "When's the next one?" "Oh, that's been cut. It's not a statutory service." So he's got to deal with HIV and all the problems and all the discrimination and so on without any formal support because that's been cut. You know, and we talk about these rights being won. I mean, I was actually outed in a cinema when I was working in the early 90s up in Newcastle, and I was sacked because I was out you know, I got abuse every day. "Hope you die of AIDS, you fag bastard. People like you brought AIDS into our community and should be left to put on the planet to bugger each other to death. I hope you die of AIDS, you fag bastard," every day from the same guy. Okay, there was no legal protection until to the regulations in 2003 for being bullied and harassed in sexuality at work. Now, what happened is I was sacked, and I appealed against my being sacked, and every single worker supported me against the management, including Mick, who said, "Hope you die of AIDS, you fag bastard," every single day. And I won my job back, and I was the first person in the 7 years that cinema had been open to win my job back. And afterwards, the abuse died down. I got almost no homophobic abuse, and instead people said, "Why are we still paying half our taxi fares home on weekdays when we still finish after the buses but have done?" And we won that. We said, "Why haven't we had a pay rise for 2 years?" We got a pay rise, okay. 275 to 282 is less than 3%. It's not a lot, but you know that was the wages back in the early 90s. You know, so we started to fight back, and you know, these people were not religious or anything that were abusing me. They were ordinary white working class people. There's one black woman there, and she got racist abuse. But you know, where do those ideas come from? They come from the media. You know, they come from the establishment. This idea that we should all be families and we should all live your life this way. And you know, that was what was challenged when I stood up when I stood up and I got my job back. And I only imagine that when we have a revolution, we've had general strike, when we're all fighting together, how people who spout this rubbish about Muslims or about gays or about trans people, how their ideas will be changed, and that's what we fight for. And that was I'd never thought about why is there homophobia until I came to Marxism in 1995, and you know, we just started discussing those ideas, and that's when I joined the SWP, and I'm still a member because we've got to fight that, and there's only one way we will liberation, and that's through revolution.
Can comrades keep their contributions to 3 minutes now, please, because we haven't got so much time. There's a number of people who have indicated. If you want to indicate to speak, please indicate now before the end. Okay, after this comrade, it'll be the comrades in the middle.
Hi, my name's Monica, and I work for CAMS, which is the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Unit. And in our unit, we'd spent quite many years trying to set up a support group for parents of transgender young people, because there were no services at all in Greenwich for those parents. And we spent years without any management support to doing it. And eventually a few of us got together and said, "Look, we're just going to do it. We're not going to wait for management to support it. We're just going to do it." And we ended up doing it sort of in a part in our own time, part in work time. So we sort of started the group at 4:30, going on to 6:30. So some of the time was our time, some of the time wasn't. There had never been really any support from the management group. And really what I wanted to talk about is how sort of austerity, how privatisation in health service, how that actually affects services for transgender young people and their parents in health. So what happened was we went on with our group because we thought, look, if we get it running and it's a good thing and people are doing well, in our naivety, we thought, well, then the management will have to support it, won't they? So that's what we thought. And we ran it for a period of time. And then one of the other people who was running the group with me was leaving the trust. So we then needed to kind of make it a bit more formal because we needed somebody else to join to help us. And also the other thing that happened, because we weren't getting much support, we got the equalities person involved. So then it's also interesting how management can use something like that against you as well as you. So you get them involved thinking they're going to support you and help you, which she did, and she's absolutely brilliant. And what she said was there's no way on earth these workers should be working in their own time for something, a service that should be provided by the trust. What did they do? They said, well, you can't work in your own time anymore. And because this service is not a commissioned service, notice the word commissioned, now that's what we have to be. We only provide the services that we are commissioned, that there isn't a budget for to do. That service was actually cut. I wrote an impassioned letter, partly of sort of emotional letter, but also with a lot of facts, because one of the things that is known very clearly from the research is the suicide levels among transgendered young people. But also one of the things that is very clear from the research is that where parents are supportive of the young people, where they've had support to help them, that actually the mental health rates are much, much lower among transgendered young people. So we put all of that into it, expecting, wrote this very long email. I didn't even get one single reply from the management on it. They completely ignored it. Absolutely. And to this day, they still haven't replied to it. So the group, then we talked to the parents themselves, and they started to get themselves organised and advocating that they want this group. So that the fight is still going on. The parents are advocating. We've got them to write to the commissioners, and so that's still going on. But I think it shows the effect. Now, I don't think that some of our managers just had no interest in it. Sure. But actually, the real problem here was austerity. We have, we're running services that have been absolutely cut to the bone. When I first started working in the team I'm working in now, there were 3 teams doing the work that one team is now doing. So there are 27 of us doing the work that 9 of us are now doing, So that shows you how, and often these services that they consider extra services, non-statutory services, are the ones that get cut the most. But it isn't all doom and gloom, because we've recently moved into a new building, and because of the agitation of a few of us in work, now none of our toilets are marked male and female. We just have toilets in our new building. So it was, so it does show that even though you can't win everything, it's still worth fighting for every single thing, because you can win some things.
This comrade will be followed by the person over there, and then the woman at the back.
Nicola was talking about education. I'm a retired school teacher, and in the 80s I was teaching, and the 90s, 15 years, I taught at a school called Crofton School in Lewisham. And at Crofton was a guy called Paul Patrick, who sadly died back in 2008. And he was such an influence on us teachers during the Clause 27 and the Section 28 stuff. Teachers wore badges around the school that we were against it, and later on in the early 90s, the deputy head, who was gay, came out in front of a whole school assembly, which was fantastic. I can still see it today, how he raised it, and people said, did he say that kind of thing? And from that, lots of more educational stuff came out, and work on LGBT and so on. The reason he came out, he told us, is because there were so many people, teachers, who were obviously outwardly supporting against homophobia. And he said that's why he came out. And I think that's a lesson to when people like Merlin was talking earlier, how people came round. It was through resistance, it was through struggle in different ways, that people didn't see somebody who was gay as being any different than themselves. And Nicola herself talked about this, and we saw the film Pride, where the miners in 1985 led the Pride March in South Wales, and where they had been clearly homophobic early on in the strike. The last thing, or second last thing, I come from Ireland. People always go on about being proud of their country. I mean, I'm pleased I come from Ireland, but I'm not proud. But one thing I am proud of is that by common franchise, Ireland voted for same-sex marriage last year, which was fantastic. Can't believe it, considering I brought up in Ireland and knowing the attitudes, but it's fantastic. And the other thing, I was on the Exeter March, the Pride March, one of the 66 marches this year, and I'm glad to say it is not taken over yet by corporations, but it's something that we've got to guard against. Thank you, Nicola.
Okay. Can comrades limit themselves to about 2 minutes now, because there's a lot of people who want to speak and I want to try and get everybody in, please. Okay.
I'm also from Ireland, as it happens, where you may have heard in the international media that we have our first gay Prime Minister, right? And interesting enough, the second last speaker before me was talking about working in a CAMS unit. Near where I live, in Ballyfermot, which is one of the most deprived areas of Dublin, half of the beds in our local CAMS unit have been closed because of mental health funding cuts, okay? Ask you a question. Who was the Minister for Health who implemented those cuts? Leo Varadkar, the first gay Prime Minister of Ireland, okay? He's also the same minister when he was a backbencher. He voted against civil partnership on the basis that the right of a child to have a mother and a father exceeds the right of two LGBT people to raise a family. Right, this is the contradictions of the ruling class, okay? They're very, very, very clear. The last speaker also mentioned, the winning the equal marriage referendum. We have had great moves forward in Ireland. Don't forget, homosexuality was illegal in Ireland until 1993. But what I want to talk about is how that happened, right? The general narrative is there was a court case in Europe, and then it was handed down, and the Parliament gave it the rights to us. That's not what happened. The court case in Europe was in the mid-1980s. In 1987, the Parliament had a debate about whether to implement the findings of that court case. They voted against it. 1987, they voted to keep homosexuality illegal. Then, in about 1992, a young rape victim who was denied the right to travel to the UK for an abortion was essentially held prisoner in Ireland. That prompted 4 or 5 day long protests, day after day after day, people saying, let her go, let her go, let her go. That was in 1992. That was the first defeat that the Catholic Church in Ireland suffered since the late 1970s. What happened then, 1993, the debate about homosexuality comes back up into the Parliament. Same MPs in the Parliament, but suddenly this time they decided we will decriminalise homosexuality. Do you think they just had a sudden change of heart? No, there was a mass movement that pushed that. Right, in 1986 as well, as mentioned, we had a referendum to legalise divorce. That was defeated. 1995, after the abortion protests, after the decriminalisation of homosexuality.
Start winding up now, please.
That's it. After the first gay Pride March, divorce is legalised. Once is the abortion movement, led by feminists, led by women, led by the SWP, played a key role in that. That broke the grip of conservative Ireland. There's many different forms of oppression, and they all feel very different. But you know what's the one thing that's common? Is the enemy. And as long as that enemy is common, it doesn't matter if the oppressions are different. We link together and we fight together.
I just want to say something about the Lancaster Pride and how that came about. It started off actually with a brilliant book launch that Nicola did in Lancaster that was attended by 35 people, all of whom signed a letter at the end saying that they wanted a people's pride, a real community pride organised by the local LGBT group out in the Bay, the Trades Council and another progressive education group, Global Link. And so we moved on and we went to have the first meeting. From the very first meeting, there was the tension between business wanting it to be a circus on a closed road, with just acrobats and things, and the rest of us saying, no, we want to march. It became difficult because the two of us that were representing the Trades Council are in a heterosexual relationship. And so you've sort of got this position where, of course it had to be led by Out in the Bay, but Out in the Bay were very much being pulled by the publican who wanted it to centre around his pub. At one point, we were talking to another member of the committee and sort of saying it's very difficult for us to push this. And she turned around and said, no, it's not actually. And she reminded us of what we actually do for a living. We are teachers and we teach children with medical needs. And we have taught 3 transgender children in the last year who are out of school because they're suffering from anxiety, suicidal feelings and all the rest of it. And so she said, it's really important that you're here for the children that you teach. And I think another important thing in Lancaster and Morecambe, we now have 2 secondary schools that have LGBT groups that meet after school and that are supported by the schools. And one of those young transgender children ended up coming to the committee and being part of the Pride organising. So the publican actually came out with the idea that he came out late in life, it's fine, where his pub is in Lancaster, he goes over the road to the opposite, to the sort of big nightclub, people come into his LGBT nightclub and it's all fine. Well, it's not fine for those kids, and there is this attitude, I think, amongst some people, particularly if they're wealthy or in business, that therefore they're protected from homophobia and transphobia, and they don't really get it. And I think we have to keep on pushing. And next year, the great thing about this year's Lancaster Pride was it was walking. We didn't have any floats, so it just meant everybody could pile on. And there are a number of other progressive groups. We had trade union banners. My nephew's a gay teacher, teachers in Stockport. He's been on Pride in Manchester for years, and he said it's the first time I've marched. And the other thing he did was he carried the NUT banner all the way around that march. So I think the lesson from Lancaster actually is LGBT, gay, straight, whatever you are, we unite and we fight, and it is a protest.
Hi, comrades. My name's Amy. I'm part of the group in Australia. Just wanted to say thanks for releasing your book again, because I first read it in 2006 when I just joined a socialist organisation, but I'd been the queer officer at my university, and I was getting rather demoralised about the process of trying to organise on the basis of identity and finding it difficult to politicise the groups that I was working with. But when I read your book, I could see the logic and the benefits of organising around left politics and class politics, not on the basis of identity. And anyway, I borrowed it from a friend, and then I promptly lost the book, and it was out of print. And now I can buy her another copy 10 years later. But I wanted to also tell a story, which is kind of a mini version of the film Pride, which happened in Australia, but nobody's made a movie about it yet. But in the early 70s, there was a big radicalisation in the trade union movement, and there's a commonality between the British gay liberation movement and the Australian gay liberation movement in that they were both connected up with the working class struggles at the time. And there was a union called the Builders Labourers Federation, which had instituted things that they called green bans across the city. So they'd refused to actually build, for example, to knock down public housing, to build in parks and, turn areas of the city into car parks and things like this. And actually the shape of Sydney as we know it today was, changed by the Builders Labourers Federation. But they actually went, a lot further than this. And there was a gay student at a college called Macquarie University who was expelled in 1973 for being gay. He tried to commit suicide, which is how the university and the college found out that he was gay. The college, which was Anglican, attempted to expel him, and he promptly went down to the student union. The editor of the newspaper was a Trotskyist, and he picked up the phone to the leader of the Builders Labourers Federation, who at the time were working on a project at Macquarie University. The Builders Labourers Federation promptly put a ban on building at Macquarie University. And they won Jeremy his spot back, but he decided not to go. And if I've got time, I'll very quickly read something that Jeremy wrote. This was the student who was at the centre of the struggle, and he told the leader of the union that he wasn't actually planning on going back to the college. And the leader of the union said to him, but we're out on strike to put you back, he said, a hint of anger in his eyes. I thought because I'd been kicked out because I was gay, I answered. Bob looked at me for a moment, directly into my eyes. All sorts of thoughts whirled in my head. Was he going to withdraw the BLF support? Did he think I'd tricked him? Then he said, I guess you're right. It's the principle of the thing. They shouldn't pick on a bloke because of his sexuality. It was now early June 1973. The builders' labourers had green-banned further building at the college and were threatening to do the same for the whole university if the college was not disciplined for its anti-homosexual attitude. It was a brave decision for a union to take. And just to put that in context, that's 25 years before homosexuality was decriminalised in every state in Australia that the BLF took that decision. Thanks.
Okay, comrade here, followed by the comrades in the corner.
Thanks. I just want to say a little bit about how important the argument is that Nicola is putting, really, which is that the basis on which we should organise to fight oppression is actually, funnily enough, not oppression but class, and how we can unite the fights around different oppressions on the basis of class. Because if you want to look at how not to do it, compare the difference between France and Britain. Because one of the things that revolutionary socialists fought for during the early days of the anti-war movement was that it was very important that we unite with Muslim groups. And this was an argument, this was a fight. People said, no, you can't do that, they're reactionary, they're sexist, etc., etc., etc. And actually in France, the backward argument won, the argument by a number of feminists that sided with the French government against the wearing of the veil and the hijab by Muslims actually led to the growth of reaction, helped the National Front to grow, and you now have a large fascist organisation in France, the Front National. In Britain, the argument that we show solidarity with each other, regardless of what their attitudes are towards women's liberation or gay liberation, we stand with the oppressed and show solidarity. Actually, that argument was won. And it meant that we built a mass movement, but it also meant, let's not be so bloody patronising and frankly racist that we think that Muslim people are incapable of drawing these conclusions for themselves about how we should show solidarity to each other. I'm very glad that Naila made that contribution, because people should know, I think it was last week, I don't know when it was, there was a vote in the German parliament on the question of same-sex marriage. Angela Merkel voted against it. Every single Muslim MP in the parliament voted in favour of it. So the conclusion for us as revolutionaries, there are, it's actually, you go on all the demonstrations now, and I'm glad the first person spoke, actually, because all the young people going on Pride don't fall for this shit, actually. They hate it. And there was lots of anti-DUP stuff and stuff like that. In other words, there is a political ferment going on, and people are questioning the whole system. And therefore, the importance of winning the kind of argument that Nicola is putting, and winning people to a party that unconditionally stands with the oppressed, but also fights for a revolution, is more important now than it's ever been.
I'm not that good at speaking in crowds, so bear with me. But I just want to talk about my experience at school when I came out. So I came out at 15 as transgender, and I wanted to change my name because by law I changed my name, but they wouldn't do it. They were like, you're calling you by, so I refused to go in school till they did it. So I got a phone call and they were like, oh, sorry. Thank you. Okay, sorry. So I got a phone call and they were like, right, we'll change it to your preferred name, but it's by law, we're not going to do it on your GCSEs or anything. So I still refused to go in. So they finally did it. So everything's in my real name now. But PE was a nightmare. It's done in 2 different genders. So every day I had PE, I refused to go in. So I was hospitalised because the stress, the pain, and it was just devastating. And that's when they actually did something. I got my GIC to write me a letter, got my doctor, and I got my mum to write me a letter to get out PE, and I did, and we won. Yeah. So, yeah.
We just have 5 minutes left before Nicola sums up, so I'm going to call this comrade and the comrades at the front here, please.
Okay, very briefly. I just wanted to follow on from what the Muslim comrade was telling us about the necessity to know for solidarity and how what it's like being lectured at about how to behave yourself and the prevent strategy. And just one more thing. Actually, I think the reality is even worse than she described, because when the prevent strategy was being formulated, Nicky Morgan, then Education Secretary, Conservative Education Secretary, suggested one symptom of Islamicist radicalisation was homophobia. This is from a member of a political party that less than 30 years ago passed Section 28, and some of the same MPs are still in Parliament. Some have been shunted upstairs to the House of Lords. If you hear what Norman Tebbett's been saying about homophobia lately, those prejudices have not died away. So yes, the gains have been tremendous, but the fact that since Trump has been elected, the expression "normalising hate speech" has entered the vocabulary, and all the implications that holds, and the fact that Theresa May is having to do deals with the DUP and with all their attendant attitudes on homophobia as well. Yes, the gains have been tremendous, but they can be rolled back very quickly, and solidarity is good.
Okay, this comrade will be the last speaker. Apologies to all the other people who put their hands up in the room. There were lots.
Okay, the comrade who spoke from Ireland also didn't mention, but actually in Ireland there was in 2015 a Gender Recognition Act which was passed, which was very, is actually better than the British, the UK Gender Recognition Act, because it's related to self-determination of people, unlike our act, which is like, 15 years old now. And that again was on the basis of, struggle. It didn't drop from the trees. It was about struggle, campaigning, and so on and so forth. I just want to make 2 points, really. One is it was one of the good things about yesterday is that when we did assemble, we were with a whole bunch of young Muslims from some various LGBT Muslim organisations, and we were going to march with them. And it was great to see them, because that's being there is an important statement. We were going to march with them, but as Nicola said, we actually couldn't get the wristbands. Nicola, Jeff, and I were sat around for about 2 hours trying to find enough people who would give us, out of the generosity of their hearts, a wristband to march and to give to Stand Up to Racism. Stand Up to Racism wasn't officially able to get onto that demonstration because they hadn't got wristbands. We were trying to find just 4 bloody wristbands to get Stand Up to Racism and the banner onto yesterday's parade. Absolutely madness, really. And it does raise the question. I really liked what the comrade said from, where was it, Lancashire. Really liked that, because she talked very, very concretely about what we can do to actually change the whole tone of the prides where we are. I mean, I don't know about your pride, but in Wakefield, it's all centred around one pub. It's a bunch of jugglers who come out, and a pretty dodgy drag queen, I have to say, last year. No, I mean, how do we change that? Well, what we have to do is get into the labour movement, is get into the local organisations, be part of the Pride committees, and concretely argue to take protest onto those, into those committees and into those events. So it's not just a question of turning up on a Sunday afternoon and having a bit of a drink and so on and so forth. It's much better it's bigger in Leeds, but the same kind of thing happens in Leeds as well. So I think we need to think about how are we going to concretely do that in the coming period. I know when the financing for the London Pride collapsed about 3-4 years ago, there was talk of trade unions and the TUC being involved in some sort of alternative. I don't know what happened to that, but that's something that in the situation that we're faced with now, and the volatility and the necessity to put those class arguments which other people have articulated, that I think is really paramount for us. Concretely, how do we bring that about? How do we do that in alliance with others? Fight together, argue about the different interpretations and understanding, of LGBT politics afterwards, and but do have those arguments, because it's vital that we win those arguments about class and about you cannot win liberation. You cannot win liberation within capitalism. You have to change that system. Fundamental argument to winning people towards revolutionary politics.
Okay, I'll ask Nicola to sum up.
Gosh, thank you so much for that really varied discussion. It was very moving, it was very powerful, and particularly thanks to the young people who came forward to speak. I'm not going to say very much, because I think the movement gives this impression that at best class is one of a series of kind of things that can hold you back. And racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, it's all kind of an array of things, and you can sort of be a mixture of those things. And you can identify as working class much as you might identify as gay. But I think that's the false that's the false consciousness of the movement that is based on identity. It's actually not true. The working class is made up of oppressed people. It is made up of people who are oppressed because of their gender, because of their race, because of their religion, because of their sexuality, because of their gender expression. It's not separate. And a revolution, the kind of change that we want to see in society, where society is turned on its head and is run by the people who know how to do it. Let's face it, the people who run our world are not fit to run it. We've got to get rid of them. They're prepared to kill, maim, starve, terrorize, humiliate people, bomb them, allow their lands to be flooded, for the pursuit of profit. That in itself disqualifies them, for me, it disqualifies them for really having the legitimacy to rule us for one day more. And this is why it's so important that we have an organisation. See, there's a lot in this country, there's a lot of hope that Jeremy Corbyn is going to get elected. And he's going to change it. He's going to make everything a lot nicer. And hopefully that will happen. And hopefully things will be a little bit nicer. But the problem is that Jeremy Corbyn is not going to change the system and turn it on its head. He is not talking about workers running society at all. And we're going to have to be here outside the Labour Party arguing that we need to take things a lot further. We back Jeremy Corbyn to the hilt, but we know that he is not going to be able to bring about a socialist world. The people that can bring about a socialist world is the working class itself, with all its oppressed groups fighting together, utterly united in that. I mean, yesterday, on the Pride March, we bumped into the Labour contingent. I'm sorry to say this, but they wanted to have nothing to do with us. And we were wearing our Kick Out the Tories badges. They saw us as people to disagree with more than they would the Tories. They were the people that jeered at Jeremy Corbyn when he came to support them on their contingent last year. We have to fight against this. We really do. The stakes are so high. So I just urge every single person in this room, if you are not a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, come into our organisation where you will find the support, the ideas, the backup, the front, and the courage and the politics to really change this world and get rid of oppression once and for all. So thanks for coming.